You remember a time when you left the house and no one could reach you? Not because you were hiding, just because you left. You remember making plans without being able to change them last minute. You showed up or you didn't, and either way, no one tracked you in real time. You remember being bored, genuinely, inescapably bored, in a way that forced you to make something out of nothing. A game, a world, a reason to move. And if this sounds familiar, Omar, you grew up in the last decade before everything changed, before the internet lived in your pocket, before your entire social life could be summarized in a notification. So what does it mean to be shaped by the 1990s? And why does that particular childhood leave such a specific psychological signature? First, this isn't about nostalgia. It's not about claiming one generation had it better or worse. This is about recognizing that the decade you grew up in wires your brain in specific ways. And people who grew up in the 90s experienced something psychologically rare. They lived in two worlds, one analog, one digital, one where you had to figure things out on your own, and one where the answer was always a click away. That transition didn't just change how you use technology. It changed how you think, how you connect, and how you handle uncertainty. People who grew up in the 90s learned to be alone with themselves in a way that's becoming psychologically extinct. You had hours, sometimes entire afternoons, where there was just nothing. No one to text, no feed to scroll, no instant way to fill the silence. So your brain had to create. It had to wander. It built entire internal worlds because there was no external one to pull you in every 30 seconds. That's not romanticizing boredom. That's describing what happens when a developing brain learns it can entertain itself, that it doesn't need constant stimulation to stay stable. That being alone with your own thoughts isn't something to escape, it's just neutral. And because of that, 90s kids often have a different relationship with solitude. It's not loneliness, it's not isolation, it's just space, the kind that's increasingly rare to find, let alone defend. There's also something specific about how 90s kids form friendships, because your social life required effort in a way it just doesn't anymore. If you wanted to see someone, you had to plan it. She'd call their house, hope they were home, coordinate with their parents, ride your bike across town, show up. The barrier to entry was real, which means friendships had to matter enough to justify that effort. You couldn't passively maintain 50 relationships by liking their posts. You had maybe 5 people you actually saw, and those 5 people knew you. Not your curated self. You. The one who showed up at their door in the middle of summer with no plan and 3 hours to kill. When it created depth by default, not because 90s kids were more authentic, but because shallow connection wasn't logistically possible yet. And now as adults, a lot of 90s kids struggle with modern friendship because it feels like no one's really there, even when everyone's available. The effort is gone. And without effort, connection starts to feel optional. But here's what nobody talks about. Growing up in the 90s didn't make you better at handling life. It made you better at handling not knowing. And in a world that now promises answers to everything, that skill has become quietly radical. You also grew up with mistakes that stayed offline, which sounds small, but psychologically, it's huge. When you did something embarrassing, it existed in memory, not in data. People forgot. You got to move on. Your worst moments weren't archived, screenshot, shared, or surfaced by an algorithm 5 years later. So that gave you something critical, the psychological safety to try things and fail without permanent record. And because of that, 90s kids often have less social anxiety around failure than the generations that came after. Not because they failed less, but because failure didn't follow them. Now as adults, they watch younger people navigate a world where every misstep is potentially permanent. And it's not that they don't understand it, it's that they didn't grow up in it. So the fear feels foreign, even though the empathy is there. There's also a unique relationship with patience that shows up in people who grew up in the 90s. You had to wait for things, not as a punishment, just as how the world worked. You waited for your favorite show to come on. You waited for the dial-up to connect. You waited for photos to be developed, for letters to arrive, for your turn on the Nintendo. That wasn't frustrating, it was just reality. And your brain learned something quiet and critical. That anticipation is part of the experience. That wanting something and having to wait for it doesn't ruin it. Sometimes it makes it better. Now in a world of instant access, 90s kids often feel a specific kind of dissonance. Not because they can't adapt to speed, but because speed removes something they didn't realize mattered. The space between wanting and having. The part that used to build meaning. And here's the quietest pattern of all. People who grew up in the 90s often feel like they're living in two timelines at once. One foot in the old way of doing things, calling instead of texting, meeting in person instead of Zoom, remembering things instead of Googling them. And one foot in the new world, fully adapted, fully functional, but also quietly exhausted by how much is expected now. You're fluent in both worlds, but native to neither. You remember what it was like before everything was connected, and you can't unknow that, which makes you uniquely positioned to see what's been gained and what's been lost. And that double vision, that's not confusion. That's perspective. The ability to hold two realities and notice what changed when we stopped being unreachable. So if you grew up in the 90s, if you remember what it felt like to be bored without fixing it, to make plans you couldn't cancel, to be alone without feeling lonely, you're carrying something that's becoming rare. You know how to exist without an audience. You know how to be patient without feeling like you're missing out. You know that not everything needs to be captured, shared, or optimized. You're not better for it. You're not worse. You're just wired a little differently. Shaped by a decade that existed in the space between the old world and the new one, and in a time when everything moves faster and louder and more visibly than ever, that wiring, that ability to just be, in without needing the world to confirm it, might be the most valuable thing you carry. You grew up in the last quiet decade, and you still know how to find it, even now. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing.